In this video, we are taking a look at the purpose of assessment strategies. Thinking about what we know so far, Ofqual have confirmed that we will need to have assessment strategies that cover the detail for each individual apprenticeship assessment. They have confirmed that they will be producing guidance on those assessment strategies. They currently provide guidance for performance points qualifications and for technical qualifications on what needs to be in those assessment strategies. We'll provide the links for those alongside this video. At first glance, those two guidance documents look very different, but when you actually pick through them, the detail of what needs to go in an assessment strategy is actually pretty much the same across the two. So we know that there is certain content, there are certain requirements of any assessment strategy, regardless of what qualification type it is for. So whilst there is specific guidance on its way for apprenticeship assessments, and there may be some detail in there that we need to go through and add into our assessment strategies, there is enough that we know from existing guidance that we can start to be developing and thinking about our assessment strategies now. So the purpose of an assessment strategy is to explain in a clear and logical manner how your design, development and delivery of a qualification is valid and fit for purpose. It sets out how you're going to do things, and then it captures your actual decisions and rationales. So one of the purposes of an assessment strategy, as defined by Ofqual, is around ensuring validity. So how will you ensure that your assessments accurately measure the knowledge, skills and behaviours of the qualification? So there's a caveat there with apprenticeships is that we now know that the behaviours are being removed from the assessment requirements of the awarding organisations, the EPAOs. So the sorts of things that you're going to need to have in your assessment strategy to meet that requirement is setting out what your development process is, who's involved in that development process, explaining how you decide what content to assess by what assessment method, what are the trade-offs you've had to think about and how do you manage those trade-offs, and how do you decide on your assessment conditions. Your assessment strategy needs to say how you maintain reliability. How will you ensure that your assessments are consistent across different assessors, different learners, and over time? So your assessment strategy needs to consider things like what guidance do you produce and what's the purpose of that guidance? What training do you provide to your assessors, to your centres, to your EQA team? And again, what's the purpose of that training? How is that training effectively helping you maintain reliability? How do you manage your centre-based assessments? And that's going to link in really closely with your CAS in particular. Your assessment strategy needs to say how you promote fairness. How will you ensure that your assessments are accessible and equitable for all learners, including those with special needs? So you need to be thinking about how do you decide what reasonable adjustments are allowed, either at a whole award and organisational level, or what do you allow across all of your qualifications? And then are there any specific reasonable adjustments that may be appropriate to an individual assessment or equally may not be appropriate to an individual assessment? How do you check the readability of your assessments? How do you ensure that your assessments are manageable for yourselves and for centres to deliver? How do you make sure that any particular assessment task doesn't offer any advantage or disadvantage to a particular group of learners? Your assessment strategy needs to say how you will support your quality assurance. So how will you monitor and maintain the quality of assessment, including internal and external verification? So it needs to include your standardisation and your moderation process. How often will you hold standardisation? How often will you moderate? What do you expect your centres to do in terms of standardisation and moderation? And again, that's as an AO, what are your basic requirements? But then thinking about each individual assessment, does a particular assessment method require more frequent standardisation or a higher level of moderation for some reason? And then you need to think about how you're going to monitor the performance of individual assessments post-go live. How are you going to make sure those assessments are performing as you expect them to, that they are being delivered as you expect them to be delivered? And finally, your assessment strategy needs to set out how you're going to meet regulatory requirements. How will you ensure that the qualifications comply with Ofqual's general conditions of recognition and any other guidance or rules for the qualification type and with any other sector's requirements? So that's going to be thinking about the policies and processes that you have in place to ensure compliance. Things like how you manage your appeals and your complaints, how you investigate and manage malpractice or maladministration, how do you manage your centres? So that's a big document. There's lots to think about. There's lots of content that needs to go in there. So remembering that your assessment strategy is about setting out how you will do something. And then it's also the nitty-gritty detail and decisions and the rationale for those decisions on each standard basis. What we would strongly advise now is start writing up your how. You know that you're going to need to have a strategy document in place that sets out how you make those decisions. How do you ensure your assessments are valid? Who do you include? What's your development process? Give that document due diligence and the time and the rounds of drafting and reviewing and amending that is going to require. When the more detailed guidance does come out from Ofqual, you'll then be able to go through and review and refine that document. Starting on it now means that you're ahead of the game, and that when your assessment plans come out, you're ready to hit the ground running. With that in mind, we have a series of webinars coming up that are designed to support you with developing an assessment strategy. So that's made up of 2 90-minute webinars, one of which is looking at designing a strategy that works in practice. So that's getting into some of the nitty-gritty detail of what needs to go into your assessment strategy. And webinar 2 is focusing in on some of the areas of that assessment strategy that may be new to any organisation that's currently endpoint assessment only. So we'll be looking at some detail of how you go about choosing the most appropriate assessment methods for the content, how you set those assessment conditions, and how you decide how to grade those assessments. You can find further details of our webinars on our LinkedIn pages, or we have a dedicated web page on the Apprenticeship Assessment reforms, which we will provide a link for. As always, reach out if you have any questions.